this is Michael Rose. The name of this channel is Music Geek Mike, and for every week through the month of April I'm going to be talking about a different aspect of Elvis Presley in the 1970s. I hope you're going to join me. I think to this day the common perception of Elvis in the 1970s is that he was basically a bloated, shambolic drug addict, touring too hard, decimating his legacy and working himself into an early grave. All of that's certainly true to one degree or another, but I feel that those who write off the entire decade in terms of Elvis's output are really missing out on some of his most fascinating performances, both live and in the studio. It seems to be largely agreed upon that Elvis's mid to late 1950s sides were seminal works that captured the raw excitement of early rock and roll, and they've certainly stood the test of time. Unfortunately, much of the 1960s were taken up with his film career, which is often derided, and rightly so. While it's questionable whether Elvis could have achieved much as an actor, it's commonly accepted that both the movies and the soundtracks were dull, lackluster, repetitive and formulaic. It's undeniable that Elvis could have better spent the time using and honing the talents that he most certainly did have as a singer and live performer. As many of you probably know, over time Elvis came to regard his movie career with some disdain too, and it wasn't until 1968 when he finally got out of the movie contract and he celebrated his return to performing with the 1968 comeback special, which was both a rating smash and a critical triumph. I'd also recommend it as a great starting point for any young Elvis fan, anyone who's never seen him in action. This is Elvis at his best. He's revitalised, looking and sounding great. If you don't get what all the fuss is about after watching the 1968 comeback special, you'll probably never get it at all. Whether Elvis's later career ever truly lived up to the promise of the comeback special is a matter of personal opinion. There were other successes, notably 1973's Aloha from Hawaii, a TV special concert broadcast to over 40 countries around the globe, but perhaps nothing that could be held up as such an unqualified critical and commercial victory. In 1968, Elvis had beaten the odds and shown that he was still a force to be reckoned with. As the 1970s wore on, increasingly the odds would be Elvis. Elvis in the 1970s is a mess of contradictions. His record sales were largely in a slump, and he often seemed to have little interest in studio work. Yet when he did enter the studio, he made some of the finest and most diverse recordings of his career. At times his voice was thin and reedy, and at other times rich, operatic, and almost better than ever. Touring had become an endless grind. His health was poor and getting worse. He was visibly deteriorating, and audiences could be reduced to tears just by the sight of what had become of their idol. Yet with a powerhouse performance of Unchained Melody, How Great Thou Art, or Bridge Over Troubled Water, he could still achieve the same effect with his voice and his performance. Shows could end with the crowd sadly looking at each other asking, "What happened?" Or they could end with a standing ovation. It's very likely that in the 1970s, Elvis gave both the best and the worst concerts of his career. It's clear that for anyone who truly respects Elvis Presley, his work in the 1970s isn't something you should just dismiss or overlook entirely. True, it's hard to dig out the diamonds without getting your hands dirty, but in this series of videos I'm aiming to put the rumour and the gossip to one side and get right at the heart of the music itself. In my opinion, the best one-stop purchase for someone looking for an overview of the decade is a 5-disc box set titled Walk a Mile in My Shoes, The Essential 70s Masters. It has close to 100 studio tracks, plus a concert disc. Next week I'll be picking out my personal top 10 from just those studio recordings. The following week I'll be looking at The King on film, both of the cinematic documentary/concert movies from the early 70s, That's the Way It Is, and Elvis on Tour, along with the 1973 Aloha from Hawaii TV special. In week 3 I'll be going beyond the pro shot recordings to take a listen to the most well-known and discussed bootlegs of the era to find out which live up to their legacies as the best shows and as the most notorious. Finally, in week 4 I'll be looking at the King's last TV special, the fascinating but devastating Elvis in Concert, its reputation throughout the years, and the arguments both for and against this piece of music history ever seeing an official release. That's all for now. I hope you'll join me for Elvis in the 1970s. Please rate, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for the top 10 list. Like no